He fingered the crysknife at his waist, thinking of the past it symbolized, thinking that more than once he had sympathized with rebels whose abortive uprisings had been crushed by his own orders. Confusion washed through his mind, and he wished he knew how to obliterate it, returning to the simplicities represented by the knife. But the universe would not turn backward. It was a great engine projected upon the gray void of non-existence. His knife, if it brought the deaths of the twins, would only reverberate against that void, weaving new complexities to echo through human history, creating new surges of chaos, inviting humankind to attempt other forms of order and disorder. Stilgar sighed, growing aware of the movements around him. Yes, these attendants represented a kind of order which was bound around Maudib's twins. They moved from one moment to the next, meeting whatever necessities occurred there. Best to emulate them, Stilgar told himself. Best meet what comes when it comes.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast. To the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest today, just want to mention we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider throwing us $1 a month there, or, if not, leave us a nice review on iTunes. For this episode, maybe something like Fear is the Mind Killer. I'm very excited about today's episode in general, and very pleased that Greg Sadler has agreed to come and speak with us about Children of Dune. And I think most of our listeners will be familiar with Greg's YouTube channel. And I think in particular, the Hegel work you've done, in addition to, just a lot of topics on the history of philosophy. But I think you've also done a review of my friend Elliot Rosenstock's recent book on the ego and the hyperstate. So Greg, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us about Children of Dune, and I guess overall the philosophy of Dune itself.
Well, you're very welcome. And I'm glad to be back on, and I've been looking forward to this for a while. It was a great excuse to do some guilty pleasure reading.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Speculative fiction. I've been doing this series called Worlds of Speculative Fiction for a while. And I also do some, I've got speculative fiction studies, which is a little bit of a grandiose term for what I'm doing, but it lets me go back and read and reread things that I haven't done and probably wouldn't get back to. I mean, I've been wanting to go back to the original Dune book for a while, but the idea of going through the series wasn't something that occurred to me until you proposed this episode. And now, actually, let me ask you this.
Sure.
So 6 books in the series. One of them is super, super famous and, is getting made into films and stuff like that. That's the first book, Dune. Why Children of Dune? Why that particular third volume for a topic of study?
So for me, I just felt like the first book, I think he kind of hints at, there's definitely things you can pick up on that I think are relative, or relevant rather, and you could apply them to, a lot of stuff from Anti-Oedipus. But, it just becomes, I think, as you continue on, at least through God Emperor, becomes philosophy and the ideas become progressively more and more, integrated into the narrative, it seems. Because I feel like in Messiah, and I don't know, maybe both of you can speak to this. So the first half of the book, before we meet the character of Hate, or, the Duncan Idaho Gola, and then, it's pretty in line with Dune. And then I think Hate starts to spout a lot of the Zenzuni philosophy.
Yeah.
Which I think is just, maybe something that, because I know Herbert himself, biographically speaking, was Catholic, but then he became a Buddhist. I think that may have had some behind some of the impetus for that inclusion of this sort of Zen philosophy aspect that Duncan Idaho brings. But then I think really in the third book is where the philosophy really dominates it's almost like a lot of people complain about the book being difficult to read because it's so, it almost really is sort of this mouthpiece for Herbert's philosophies. And then of course that really culminates, I think, in God Emperor. Weirdly at the end, the final two books, which would be what? Heretics and Chapter House. Then it goes back to being a little bit more action oriented and less philosophy. So it's kind of a weird evolution that he takes across the series.
He got some feedback, right? And hey, more action, more of the fun stuff.
But I had read also, I guess to color that, I had read this when I was in high school, and I think maybe that sort of, you know what I mean? Because the kids, the twins, are like every adult that they come into contact with throughout the narrative, they're just totally, they're owning them. You know what I mean? They're really dominating them and just making them look extremely foolish. So maybe there was kind of like maybe there's a sort of Nietzschean element to it. You know what I mean? You'd read Nietzsche as as a frustrated teenager, and it sort of sticks with you. So I think maybe it's that sort of gripped me.
Some wish fulfillment, you identify with the characters who do the things that you wish you could have done. And who wouldn't like to be, filled with a million different personalities that they have to try to draw upon and integrate without letting them take them over,
I mean, speaking of anti-Oedipus, that is something that came to mind with especially like the notion of the Kwisatz Haderach and having all the different personalities and the destratifications that can come too soon with like Aaliyah, right? Having the Baron Harkonnen grandfather ego memory take over, and that being a destructive line, but the other side of it too being someone like Leto II, obviously the God Emperor being able to tap into those voices, that kind of the process of schizophrenia, if you want to like think about it that way as a creative line. That almost seems like Leto II was an excuse to do some of that philosophy stuff. Coop, what do you think? Do you think that's like almost was an excuse for Herbert to be able to go into this more cerebral aspect, is building this larger than life character?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think so. Especially now, I know you didn't get a chance to read God Emperor, but that's really where, and a lot of people, that's their favorite book of the series is God Emperor. Children is the one that gets, I think, the most. Children and Messiah are kind of the two that, at least out of those four,
they're the bastard children.
They get sort of, you get the most complaints about, and then people love God Emperor.
I haven't run across anybody who really likes God Emperor that much, including myself.
Yeah.
I like it. It's part of the series. I do think it is pretty didactic. One of the things that Herbert did that you see a lot of other people imitating later on is having little vignettes from a document at the beginning of each chapter.
Yes.
I mean, almost all of them in God Emperor are from his secret, let's call them secret notebooks, because I'm forgetting the name of them, right? And so he's revealing his ideas and his plans. I think that they're not all. There's a few that are from other people's things as well, but you don't have the, whatever you want to call it, diverse points of view, heterogeneity. It's all very of the same,
I was thinking about how much I mentioned before we started to Greg about Wheel of Time. And I know that Coop may not have read it, but Greg, I don't know if you've read it, but so much of Wheel of Time now comes into focus reading Dune and how much Robert Jordan pulled from it. Particularly, well, one of the things you said, the sort of the histories, whether it be from Irulan or I'm forgetting the pen name for Maneo, his advisor later, who kind of becomes one of the historians to write down Leto II stuff. But you have the little epigraphs at the beginning, the little subsections. You see a lot of that in Wheel of Time, but also even though it only comes up once in the first book, the notion of the Shaitan notion, even that's like directly stolen. And Shaitan becomes one of the names for the bad guy in Wheel of Time, just to simplify. But anyway, I'm glad to go back and read this. Dune was one of my dad's favorite books. He was a big sci-fi nerd, Asimov, but definitely Dune was one of his favorites. So going back and reading this, getting to read the first three novels, made a lot of impact for me. And I remember when I visited Coop back in November, we watched the original movie, the quote unquote original, the Lynch version. And since I hadn't read the book, I did ask a lot of questions, but Coop and his roommate were nice and like filled me in on a lot of the stuff. And it's I can kind of see why Lynch would be interested. I would have liked to have seen what Lynch would have done depicting Leto II as the kind of as the God Emperor sandworm hybrid. I'm sure he would have done something fun with that.
You know, there are some things that are, I won't say easy to do because not everybody can do them, but at least easier in a medium like film to do, like do really cool fight scenes or dramatic, backgrounds, or, zooming in on cool features of characters and stuff like that. One of the things that I think is a massive challenge for adapting Dune, and it's one that I think is really tough for a lot of different film or TV adaptations of a deep complex series, is capturing the interplay of a number of different, not just characters, but forces, ideological forces. Like, in Dune, you've got House Carino, the Emperor. You've got these two different, houses. One is very good, like the Atreides, and one is very bad, like the Harkonnen. But you also have the guild in the background. You have the Bene Gesserits. Yeah, the Bene Gesserit. You have the Fremen themselves, right? And it's interesting because there was a tabletop game that was developed by Avalon Hill years and years and years ago, before that company went defunct, and it had those 6 as the players, so you could take on one or another, and it kind of makes sense. For example, Martin's Game of Thrones, which has lots and lots of moving parts, similarly, and how poorly adapted it was by the showrunners. And somebody's got an essay out there. The classification they used was the showrunners are used to doing the typical Hollywood stuff with psychological stories as opposed to sociological stories.
Interesting.
And then with Dune, we've clearly got an ecological story as well, right?
Right.
So how do you bring that to film in a way that's good? I mean, Lynch would be a good candidate for doing that, except I don't think he succeeded in getting across the machinations behind the scenes, right?
Right.
Going on, which are philosophies, essentially.
I was going to say Villeneuve seems to have captured making Dune itself, the atmosphere. If you want to let that stand there for the ecology, that seemed to be given pride of place as a character, right? The whole the immensity of the desert comes across somewhat. So it's interesting to see what he'll do in the second part, if that will continue to inspire, as you said, that ecological aspect too, needing to have voice.
Yeah, and I think with the second part, we're going to be, those of us who've read the books are going to be looking really at how he treats the Fremen. Right now we've got, they're, these wandering desert people. They like to fight with knives. It's kind of, I'm not going to trivialize it because it was, I watched it. It was quite impressive, but it's not yet conveying what Herbert brought before our eyes in his text.
He is beginning to hint, I think, at some of the things that are coming. It's funny, they even had cited a line, or they stole a line from children in the part 1 of the Villeneuve movie, rather. It was something about life is a reality to be experienced.
Yeah, you put that in your notes a couple of times.
It's not a process to be overcome or something. It's a reality to be experienced. I'd have to pull up the exact quote, but it was interesting to see that come up in the film.
That sounds similar to a thing that gets attributed to Kierkegaard quite a bit.
Interesting.
I'm trying to remember the formulation, but it's along a similar lines, but I'm not sure where in Kierkegaard works it's supposed to arise, So it might actually be an apocryphal.
What's also interesting is, Greg, you brought up the tabletop game. So it's really neat that there was actually, in terms of video games, the very first Dune game became like incredibly influential among, I think it's like these like Command and Conquer style games for PC or something. I don't know. My roommate showed me this video on YouTube
in college. And
that's funny.
I was a terrible roommate. This is total trivia, but I was a heavy smoker. I'd even I exercised, and I had this poor roommate, and we didn't have like air conditioning or anything. We're in these storms. This is back in like the 90s. And I would sit in the summer, and I was working like second shift security. So for the college, so I could just like screw off during most of the day.
Yeah.
And I would sit there and I'd be blasting. At that time, it was the CD that I had on like constant rotation was Pearl Jam's One. So I'd be blasting that through the speakers, chain smoking, sitting in front of my PC, playing almost always as the Atreides. Every once in a while, I'd play as the Harkonnens. And then they had that made up non-canon thing, the Ordo, right? Where you could have spies and stuff. And I'd play it for hours and hours. And the poor bastard, I mean, he was lucky he had a mom in town because he would go and like stay with her. And yeah, I was a pretty bad roommate, but I got locked into it. You know how it is with video games, right? You start playing it and hours go past. And especially if you've got like, you know, fridge stocked with sodas or beer and, you know, cigarettes to smoke and stuff like that.
That's all you need. That's all you need.
And have the curtains pulled, you know, so that it was really dark in the room as well.
One kind of cool note is that in A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari directly cite Children of Dune. I've pulled the passage. It's in the treatise on nomadology, the War Machine section. And what I might do is go ahead and read this a little bit, this passage. And then I think I even grabbed the text from the page that they cited as well. And so this might be a good place to start out the conversation in earnest. I don't know if you guys agree or have any thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Does that sound good? Nomad organization is indissolubly arithmetic and directional. Quantity is everywhere. Tens, hundreds, direction is everywhere. Left, right. The numerical chief is also the chief of the left or the right. The numbering number is rhythmic, not harmonic. It is not related to cadence or measure. It is only in state armies and for reasons of discipline and show that one marches in cadence. But autonomous numerical organization finds its meaning elsewhere. Whenever it is necessary to establish an order of displacement on the steppe, the desert, at the point where the lineages of the forest dwellers and the figures of the state lose their relevance. He moved with the random walk which made only those sounds natural to the desert. Nothing in his passage would indicate that human flesh moved here. It was a way of walking so deeply conditioned in him that he didn't need to think about it. The feet moved of themselves, no measurable rhythm to their pacing. In the war machine and nomadic existence, the number is no longer numbered, but becomes a cipher, and it is in this capacity that it constitutes the esprit de corps and invents the secret and its outgrowths, which would be strategy, espionage, war ruses, ambush, diplomacy, etc. A ciphered, rhythmic, directional, autonomous, movable, numbering number. The war machine is like the necessary consequence of pneumatic organization. Moses experienced it with all its consequences. This will kind of repeat a little bit of the text, but this will be the actual citation that they're making from the text of Children of Dune. Leto was far out on the sand when he heard the worm behind him, coming to his thumper there in the dusting of spice he'd spread around the dead tigers. There was a good omen for this beginning of their plan. Worms were scarce enough in these parts most times. The worm was not essential, but it helped. There would be no need for Ghanima to explain a missing body. By the time he knew that Ghanima had worked herself into the belief that he was dead, only a tiny, isolated capsule of awareness would remain to her, a walled-off memory which could be recalled by words uttered in the ancient language shared only by the two of them in all of the universe. Secher Nui. If she heard those words, golden path, only then would she remember him. Until then, he was dead. Now Leto felt truly alone. He moved with the random walk, which made only those sounds natural to the desert. Nothing in his passage would tell that the worm back there, human flesh, moved here. It was a way of walking so deeply conditioned in him that he didn't need to think about it. The feet moved of themselves, no measurable rhythm to their pacing. Any sound his feet made could be ascribed to the wind, to gravity. No human passed here. So there's a couple angles or divergences that we could take discussion-wise here. What I think, the two, I'll just lay these out and maybe throw it to one of you. One angle that we could go in and probably be a good sustained thread would be the way that Muad'Dib, I think, captures the Fremen war machine and appropriates it and uses it against the existing empire. So there's that line. There's also what I think this is perhaps also referring to could be becoming imperceptible. And along those lines, this would be something like, because I think what's interesting too, and along those lines would be the Fremen as a whole, right? Their sort of society, they're like very attuned to their milieu on Arrakis through the way that their economy being based on water retention and so forth. And also how that kind of overcodes their sort of very strict hierarchy within, or not necessarily a hierarchy, but I guess the socius of the Fremen tribe is a very highly coded thing, right? For survival, water's the most valuable substance on the planet, keeping them alive. So I think that's another perhaps interesting economic, maybe even libidinal economics we can get into. But I don't know if either one of you have thoughts on either one of these potential lines.
I mean, I do want to say this. I think you're right in using the word hierarchical. It's not a hierarchy that is established once and for all. There's mobility within it, right? But you retain the hierarchy. So like you become a sietch leader, right? Or you challenge somebody and you move up in that way, and you take their water too after you kill them. You have moved up, but the structure remains the same, right?
Yeah, just be like a sort of, that's almost kind of like our standard sort of, I don't know, not revolution, perhaps, like there's a sort of change, but ultimately the structure remains, right? Like we're not addressing these sort of fundamental
and
pillars or strata.
With the Fremen, at least in Dune, while Liet Kynes is still around, motivating them as somebody who's bringing knowledge about how things could be transformed, there is a revolution going on. And it's out of the sight of the Empire and the Harkonnens who control the planet. And the Atreides are able to tap into it, not while they first get there, because obviously, they're done in by this big plot and stuff like that. But they're already laying the grounds for that, with Gurney Halleck going off to the smugglers and Paul and his mother Jessica going off with the Fremen. He's already met Stilgar, right, at the beginning, I think. So it's not a mere like cyclical repetition of social structure. They are going to change Arrakis eventually. They're just not sure how the hell it's going to happen given the massive forces that they're dealing with. And then, luckily Paul Atreides comes along and everything slides into place. But then, I mean, you look at Dune Messiah and the jihad has taken place. You're right. There is a war machine, and the war machine quickly morphs into something that is kind of business as usual, just, different bosses, different faces.
Yeah, but in a certain sense, you're right. It has the essence of the war machine. It kind of obviously goes against, even in Dune originally, it goes against the Empire and the confederacy of houses that have kind of teamed up to want to get their own little share of the spice trade. I was thinking about what Coop said about becoming imperceptible, and with the Fremens, you see that there are concentrations of Fremens who kind of act as the surplus laborers in the kind of little townships. But then there's the Sieches, which are, for the most part, incalculable. They kind of evade the metric system, the numbering, and they're underestimated for that reason. One of the maybe subterranean threads, not to pun, is how many of them are there? This is a question that gets asked from a lot of different angles, from the Harkonnens to the Emperor to even Paul Atreides and Leto Atreides themselves. There is this kind of rumbling about how many millions there are, and we never get a definite answer. So they evade the numbered number that is the kind of the state apparatus's means of calculation. And you can see this as directly opposed to knowing exactly how many legions of Sardaukar are coming. There's at least 2 legions that are dressed up as Harkonnens, and that's about 30,000 men, I think, is something like that they maybe 3,000. I forget in any case, the count of the numbers we get kind of like there's 3 legions of Harkonnens and 2 of the Sardaukar, whatever. But there is a numbered labeled of them. But there is this more incalculable numbering number insofar as the Sietch, unlike if there are these little polises, these little towns that have aggregated and cut up space, there is with the Sietch kind of more of an open distribution, right? As Deleuze always wants to kind of use the nomos as opposed to the polis. And so there's that aspect of it too, I think, that is important. And it goes to that question of their imperceptibility, their incalculability, and also to this quoted section about the sort of, obviously you can't do a march on the desert. You're going to, your armies are going to be eaten up. You have to do something that doesn't have cadence, the cadence of a march, the cadence of a state that has appropriated a military machine, right? I think that's another one of those little fundamental axioms in this plateau is about the difference between an appropriated war machine that becomes a military machine versus the sort of the war machine we're seeing and we're talking about with the Fremen. And I guess one of the things too that I thought was really interesting was that, and I know this has to do with the prophecies that are planted for however many millennia by the Bene Gesserit priestesses, but this notion that an outsider of the group will come into the group and sort of marry into the group, whether, I don't know if that's part of the prophecy, but will become their Messiah and their leader. I think this points to Anti-Oedipus as well with the formation of an imperial state. It has to be this paradoxically exogamous, endogamous, incestuous relationship that creates the state. The despot is one that kind of overcodes the lineages and forms this crazy new alliance, which I think culminates in the jihad, as we talked about. Those are just some of those little lines. If we're going to bring in Deleuze and Guattari and sort of rhizomatically spawn off into the books.
Well, springboarding off of that, going back to the thing about you can't march across the desert. With a military, so if we take the Sardaukar as an example, right, they're the prime military. They've got training that puts everybody else at a disadvantage, although the Atreides are getting close, apparently. And
right.
Eliminate them. So you've got training, and that's one aspect of it. And then you've got deployment, which is what you're talking about there. Doesn't do any good to have the best weapons. I mean, this is part of what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. As it turns out, the Russian army is not only, poorly trained, but is incredibly bad at actually deploying in a battlefield.
Interesting.
In terms of logistics, right? And so what should have been a fairly easy, straightforward military operation based on what everybody was thinking about Russia turned out to be impossible for them. And so now we've got this quagmire that's going on. And there's really nobody who can deploy in the desert as a military force unless they have adapted themselves to the desert the way the Fremen have with concealment and also, not taming, but harnessing the worms. And so the Sardaukar are
desert power, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they're unprepared for that sort of thing. I mean, much later on in God Emperor with these fish speakers, right? The only real military force left. I mean, you do have things like the Tlaxu face dancers but they're really the only military force left. And there are no worms anymore. Arrakis has been turned into this, wonderful planet that can't produce the spice cycle anymore. They can deploy essentially anywhere. Right. And I guess to bring this to a close, in a way, one of the dreams of anybody who is taken by the military mind is a military that can not only outmatch other people quantitatively in like better equipment or better training or something like that, but to be able to go everywhere, to go into any niche and bring greater force to bear. And we see over and over again, when that does work, it produces sterility. And that's part of why that's part of why Paul first and then Leto want something different for the galaxy than what their followers have produced. What that's going to look like at the end of God Emperor is unclear, but then it's filled out in the later novels.
Taylor, it's really interesting that you brought up this exogenous figure. It's an interesting sort of dichotomy or like dialectic between Leto and Paul in that way, in the sense that, Paul really becomes the despot. Obviously, we see that shake out in Messiah. But what is also interesting relative to that is how important the way that he is controlled is by one is like love, but then there's offspring. Those are the two, really, maybe the offspring are sort of the biggest thing at stake, or his biggest, not exactly a vulnerability, but just to contrast this to somewhat like what Leto does is he forgoes his direct descendants. Like, you know what I mean? He forgoes children directly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, as opposed to Paul actually has direct heirs versus Leto, who kind of stands outside by this. He sort of castrates himself in a sense. And then, this we could really even go further into like Schraber a little bit too, because I feel like he's almost becoming like he's born a man, then he transitions to worm, and then in the end of God Emperor, whenever he dies, right, he gives birth to the new worms. So he repopulates Arrakis with a new species, a new Taylor. You might be able to take that and run with it.
Well, yeah, he gives birth to the new humanity through the Golden Path on the one hand, but he gives birth like Schreiber, but he gives birth to the new spice givers, right? With the worms. And so he gives also birth to a new world after he's already changed it. And so there's that aspect too. And obviously to the incestuous moment where after the imposition of the sort of castration or even a becoming worm in the becoming woman. There's some pun there that I can't figure out yet. But he marries his sister, right? He marries Ghanima to make sure that she is not held open for some other house to come and marry, right? He doesn't leave his sister open to make sure the empire isn't sort of seated away, appropriated by another house, away from Atreides. So there is that aspect too. And I do think that
which is interesting, given that the whole thing is kicked off by Jessica bearing a son to Leto, right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which could have been, and a female child could have been married to Fade and sealed this and harmonized everything in terms of this sort of, what is it? It's like a feud that's been going on, I think dating back to the Butlerian Jihad, but that's just for additional color.
Well, what she was supposed to give birth to a
girl, a girl
that would marry into the Harkonnens.
Correct, and then that child would be the Kwisatz Haderach,
which that would be another form of the incest, since she herself was
Harkonnen,
daughter,
a Baron Harkonnen. Yeah,
right. So that would be another form of incest going on, and of course I think that's even discussed several times in Messiah and Children of Dune. This notion that, of course, for the Fremen, that is outlawed, that is sort of against their way of, and Stilgar, he's kind of abhorred by it, but he's being told, look, this always happens with royalty, right? There's all this kind of inbreeding.
You could say incest is a matter of degrees, right? So brother and sister, total incest right there.
Mm-hmm.
Breeding, as the Bene Gesserit are doing, Harkonnens and Atreides together that are, like cousins, maybe not quite so much.
Right.
You look at this in the Middle Ages when it became like a political issue. Well, I like the wife right now, so maybe it's not incestuous, but fall out. So then I find a bishop who can say that, yes, this is consanguineous and we have to get rid of this marriage. I think a lot of this is once you get away from like, nuclear family, brother, sister, mother, son, father, daughter, and you start getting off into these breeding programs, it becomes a much more pragmatic determination, which is tied in with, sort of feelings of disgust or revulsion, proscriptions, right? But it's how far you can push it, So, and I mean, what do we make of Leto's breeding program? Everybody's an Atreides, right? And then he's got Duncan Idaho like bred in at multiple points, but Duncan is not quite what he was because he's been messed with in these tanks by the talks. It was wrapping my head around some of this, trying to understand this breeding program that's being referenced in God Emperor of Dune. It's really hard to visualize generation after generation of people who are, it seems, chosen by, or at least arranged. Things are manipulated in such a way so that even though they, like Idaho says, I'm not a stud, you're not gonna make me have sex with this woman. Inevitably he does, these things are engineered. Isn't that in some ways, it's not incestuous as such, but it seems there's something off-putting about it, to say the least, right?
Yeah, especially because the Gola is, in particular, what differentiates a Gola between a clone is the clone is made from living tissue. The Gola is made from dead tissue, which I think adds a whole other element to this, a whole other weirdness to this already very extremely weird situation relative.
I just want to interject Duncan. One other thing that comes from that too, which is in that book, they talk at a number of points about Tlaxu nastiness. Like, we're going to get this, you were subjected to Tlaxu nastiness in being the Gola. Let's get that all behind us. You cleanse the new Duncan Idaho, because there's, who knows how many Duncan Idahos have been generated, but you've got to like wash that Tlaxu stink off of him.
Yeah. And eventually he go on to sort of have 1,000 sons and 7 daughters with one of the Atreides, with Siona, who who like actually kills Leto II.
Well,
They see like a new genetic trait out into the world that can avoid the prescient.
They can be what it does is
they become imperceptible, right?
Exactly,
they see the imperceptibility in a different sense, right? Because they can avoid the prescience, which again is this story of lineages and alliances that we're talking about.
Right. And it gets even more meta because there are beings that are even beyond, just to get into the real spoiler crazy shit territory with this, is the Tleilaxu face dancers start being able to absorb memories. So then they become like these basically people that never die. Like they become these sort of godlike creatures. And I think at the very end, so there's like this even higher dimensional these higher dimensional beings that Leto is trying to prevent from being, I think, from being perceived by those beings.
You know, I mean, in sci-fi and fantasy stuff, that is not that unusual, right? You think about, you know, you transfer from one body to another, you know, your mind or stuff like that. For example, in Philip Jose Farmer's World of Tears, right, where the godlike figures, I forget exactly what they're called, they do this fairly routinely so they can live a long time. Or, you know, we have other things where, and of course, you know, there's all sorts of mechanics that would have to be worked out to make this happen, but you basically swap somebody's consciousness from one body to the next and just keep going that way. So that doesn't strike me as something, you know, radically new. The idea, going back to, you know, Paul Atreides at first, and then Leto and Alia and Ghanima, of having the burden of carrying around ancestors who talk within you. I mean, you think back,
yes,
like how big your family tree is. You know, potentially you've got just about everybody. You know, you go back far enough. In I don't remember whether it's in Children or in God Emperor, but Leto talks about remembering the first Atreides, and these are supposed to be like Agamemnon, you know, the legendary Atreides who may or may not have existed. But in this, he's real, and he's way back there, but not, there's even further back. I forget the name of the oldest of the personalities, you know.
What you talking about, Harum? The pharaoh, so to speak, that Leto II claims is like this cruel kind of Hammurabi-esque type.
That's right.
Yeah.
And now think what it would be like to survive, but stuck inside somebody else who may or may not ever become conscious of you. You're competing with like a million other voices, and maybe they'll bring you in as part of, I don't know, like a council or something, or maybe some other voice. You know, if you got a Baron Harkonnen in there, that jerk will take over and you'll never get a chance to say anything, but you're stuck there. And now you're not just stuck also in Paul Atreides, you're also stuck in Alia. You're also stuck in these kids, right?
I was thinking about how the Becoming Woman that Cooper brought up earlier with Leto II kind of really crystallizes what the Bene Gesserits are building up to with the Kwisatz Haderach, right? Yeah. Which is supposedly going to be one of the first beings that can access the ancestral cellular, you know, microcosmic memories of male and female. There is this line in like the first Dune book about after Paul takes the sip of the water of life, you know, he goes comatose for a couple of weeks, but when he's kind of revived, he has this vision of becoming more than a man, right? Of no longer being just a man. And he has this vision of these two essences of the giving and taking, which is very kind of, yin yang type thing, but being able to tap into both sides, being able to take and to give, and this becoming more than a man, which I think Cooper here is indicating in the notes something along the lines of what we're talking about with these proliferation of names that aren't just the memories, but also the different names of Paul as Usul or Muad'Dib, Emperor. I'll let you guys take over from there. I was just kind of thinking of all of these multiplicities that we're dealing with.
Since Greg mentioned the Tleilaxu, I just wanted to bring up really quickly one interesting angle of, I guess, about the sort of libidinal economics of this would be that it's interesting that the Bene Gesserit, who are all women, are the sort of stewards of this sort of breeding program within the Imperium. So that's kind of a reversal from like historically the way that the trading of women or the exchange of women has been. That was like the original libidinal economy at the tribal level, and maybe even prehistoric, etc. To contrast that with the Tleilax Sioux, for the Tleilax Sioux, they actually have no women. Their women are the axolotl tanks.
Yeah.
So it's this very, like, they've really instrumentalized reproduction and really appropriate. It's such a, like, it's taking the appropriation of reproductive labor of like human women and then like extrapolating to the nth degree. Like it's really bearing out that line of logic all the way till its most extreme point in terms of, I guess, the sort of mechanization of reproduction.
Yeah.
But I also think, it's kind of interesting that Leto reappropriates as this sort of phallic emperor, the breeding program. And then at sort of the end, then the Bene Gesserit sort of become the more like the protagonists at sort of the final two books in the whole series.
One of the other names too, we should remember that we learn about Paul's identity is the preacher. That's here.
True. Yeah. He is cagey for a long time about that, right? Maybe he is, maybe the preacher
right.
is, maybe the preacher isn't. And then towards the end of is it Children of Dune, he's clear about it. Yeah, I think
yes.
There's another series, and I did want to talk about a few other series by comparison to this, with the turning women into essentially breeding tanks. I wonder if R. Scott Bakker took that from Frank Herbert. If either of you have read the Prince of Nothing series, we find out in the third book, The Thousandfold Thought, I think it was, or maybe it's later in the series, that this group of monks who've withdrawn into sort of a safe space away from all the evil creatures that are trying to take over the land and have become pretty inhuman themselves, have effectively turned all of their women into, they're described as something sort of like whales, but they're there for breeding, and this is a sign of like the recognizing this. I think actually it is in the later parts of the series, the Aspect Emperor quadrilogy, they're recognized as evil because of this, something that they didn't see as evil themselves, and that's precisely a sign of how depraved they've become.
Yeah, it is interesting to think that there is an interesting dynamic about where the power lies, because obviously the Bene Gesserits are almost the penultimate sort of order of power and manipulation, and so it's not necessarily that women are completely powerless. Obviously, to the contrary, right? It is, but on the other hand, it is interesting that other forms of power are typically masculine for the most part. The leaders of the houses, it seems, the emperor, the Sardaukar, but maybe with the Fremen, it's hard to. It seems like their war machine is both male and female, at least is what I got. And there is an interesting question where power lies, because then it becomes more complicated after the first Dune, where with like the Tleilax Sioux, they're almost amorphous, right? They're like polysexual. They can kind of transform.
Well, the face dancers, yeah.
Sure. They're also a different kind of in between of becoming that is different than the Kwisatz Haderach.
Now that I remember too, that was something else that I was struck by recently with respect again to R. Scott Bakker. So I don't know if either of you have read his Second Apocalypse stuff, but he's got these things that are called skin spies, and they've been developed genetically by the big baddies in it. And they've got, instead of like actual features like we do in bones and stuff, they've got a whole bunch of appendages on their face, and they can basically imitate anybody. And they sound so much like face dancers that you're like, we know which of these came first. Did you just like lift this out of there? Not to knock backer because he's a great storyteller, the really awesome world building, lots of philosophy built in there as well. But it does seem suspiciously similar.
It's interesting you brought him up because he's one of my wife's favorite authors, and she's constantly told me to try to get him on the podcast. So just to, if you're listening out there, Scott, we'll contact you at some point.
That would be really cool. He seems to like kind of dropped off the map.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, yeah. One of the things she said was she loved the stuff so much. It was the philosophy stuff. She wanted me to read the books for me and Coop to explain it, to explain that side of it. But I guess I want to jump in with a question for both of you, since this is where we are in the part of the notes. I want to know about Herbert's the backstory for Dune with the Butlerian Jihad, which is sort of this prehistory, or it's the sort of antecedent to the story of Dune, where, and I think it coincides with the rise of the Bene Gesserits, if I'm understanding the history correctly, where there were these machines, these thinking machines that supposedly had artificial intelligence capabilities, right? Because part of the axiom after this war against the machines was you won't make a machine in the likeness of a human. I want to know a little bit about this backstory and how it informs the Dune universe. If you guys want to say anything about that, just for my benefit.
There's a place, and I don't remember exactly where it is in God Emperor of Dune, where Leto is talking maybe with Idaho or maybe with one of the fish speakers, and he's referencing the thinking machines. And he says that the problem wasn't just that there were the thinking machines, it's that human beings had begun to think like the thinking machines.
Interesting.
That they were adapting themselves around it. And I mean, we see stuff like this in critiques of technology all the time.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Gabriel Marcel has this wonderful phrase that we become prey to our own technics, but so many other people have said that sort of thing. It leads to a kind of remodeling ourselves as if we are just mechanistic machines. And this is different, I think, than the sort of stuff that to bring in Deleuze again, like when he talks about machines, like for example when he's looking at Leibniz in the fold, everything can be a machine, but a machine is not a mechanism, right?
Yes.
And I think that's a distinction that a lot of people lose. And you don't have to be super into artificial intelligence or machines to do that. You could just be the kind of person who has a stock set of phrases and thinks that, if they're going to do well in sales just by using this patter, and then they go home, after the day and they don't think much about what they do, and they watch some TV, eat a little something, go to bed, get up the next day, do it. They've effectively turned themselves into something like a machine. And their engagements with others are machine-like, and the issue is how to escape that sort of sterility. And I think this goes to the golden path thing, which we can talk about a bit more
right
later. But Cooper, what do you think?
Let's see. As far as the Butlerian Jihad, so it's not really, Frank himself doesn't ever really get much into it. Now, you do see, like Greg had pointed out, there's a little bit of discussion because Leto can access those memories. So it does go into it, but it's never really addressed full on until the prequels that are done by the Son, which a lot of people, including myself, are not the biggest fans of.
It's not canon, right, in your eyes.
Exactly. But
what should we make of that sort of reconstruction after the fact? You're right. It's not canon, but it's presented as canon. Right?
Yes. I was making a joke, but I don't know what's canon or not.
I think this is why George R.R. Martin doesn't want anyone to finish Song of Ice and Fire if he passes away, to be honest.
Well, it's already happened, at least on the screen. So
yeah. True. There's another interesting case like this. Roger Zelazny, the Chronicles of Amber. He writes 10 books.
Okay.
And then, he writes a ton of other stuff as well, right? And then he dies. And his estate, contrary to Zelazny's expressed wishes, hires another guy to come in and write prequels because people love prequels, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people who knew Zelazny, who are really, kind of big names, including Martin, said, yeah, this is a terrible idea. You should. And I guess the books I've never read them, but I guess they're not very good at all. And that seems to be the way it works, right?
Well, it's kind of the Hollywood effect of sequels and prequels and sort of milking things for all their
mining
worth.
IP,
mining IP. But
Yeah.
but the I guess one of the things I wanted to ask to reformulate the question before we move on is the Butlerian Jihad a means for introducing the Mentat into the world, and thereby, because I think without the Mentat training that Paul has, and therefore Leto has to a certain extent with accumulating all of those memories and those life experiences, without the Mentat becoming an essential aspect, would the calculations of the future and the past and all that make as much sense? I don't think so. And I guess maybe you guys could say a word or two about Mentats and that kind of human computer aspect insofar as it's important for the prescience, because Mentats with prescience seems like a very key aspect of so much of this time bending going on. What do y'all think about that?
There's a lot to address here, because I think one thing I wanted to add about the Butlerian Jihad is that what this goes to is this sort of very base materialism that Herbert relies on, where, you know, it's evinced by things that he says, like, what is it? God created Arrakis to train the faithful.
Yes.
Right. So it's like he's very keen on like these Darwinian, the genes, or like one of the early scenes within God Emperor that I wanted to bring up was he's watching Siona Atreides getting chased by these D-wolves, and he's getting so excited because like it's like the predator prey, the pressure of the wolves is like making her the wild Atreides gene. Like he's got this weird sort of sort of vitalism, I think, element of Frank that I think gets expressed. So I just think that Butlerian Jihad and removing machines thinking machines rather from the equation, because we still do have machinery. We just don't have thinking machines necessarily.
But the training the humans have to start emulating the machine. They have to start taking on qualities of the thinking machines. And does that even extend to the guild navigators? They have some sort of Mentat capacities in order to predict with the spices help.
They're doing a different.
They're doing something different. They're just getting high as fuck. Or
but I do think that Herbert is sophisticated enough that he thought that this mathematical approach, this very straightforward, linear, relying on empiricism, was not going to be the way. You're never going to be able to understand the totality of the universe just purely with mathematics alone.
Gotcha.
I get the sense that the Mentats are not doing an awful lot of purely mathematical operations, though.
I think they're doing data analysis.
Yeah, they're working with a sort of logic of which you see reflected in, you know, some medieval stuff, and also like the cultivation of dialectic and rhetoric from the Renaissance on. This sort of more, we need to take in all the possible information, like you're saying, data analysis.
Right.
And some of it can be mathematized, but we also need to be careful about what we can't. And we can talk about, say, like probability curves and things like that. But it's just, you know, what's probable, what's plausible, what could be inferred from this. And it's interesting to see too that there's also reflections on the part of Paul and the part of Leto about what a Mentat can and can't do. So there has to be something more than the Mentat that can use the data that the Mentat, or the inferences that the Mentat gets, judgments.
It does seem that prescience is a little bit different than what the Mentat does. Is that correct?
Prescience seems more you're being confronted with lots of information that would be temporally organized, but now is flooding you as a present. And to go back to the guild navigators, I mean, their prescience seems to be basically about where not to hit a meteor storm.
right.
Not to lose the track or something like that.
Avoid the gravity belts and stuff. Or the
because
asteroid
before
belts.
them, I mean, space travel exists. It's just not as reliable.
Yes.
You know?
Or safe.
So, you know, this does go to kind of a logistical mathematization thing, because if you're going to spend the money to make a starship and load it up with cargo, you don't want it to have a 95% chance of getting there. You want it to be 100. You know?
Yes, that makes sense. And I was wondering too, I'm just trying to remember from the Lynch version, the blue stains of the mentat, is this a different type of I've asked you this, Coop. Tell me this. Is this a different type of drug that they're using than the spice?
Yeah, this was the juice of safu, and it's red, actually.
Okay, gotcha. I was wondering about this interesting, before we move on, this interesting sort of pharmacological aspect to the stories. How much of addiction, or not even addiction, that's the wrong word. How much of the inputs from even living on Arrakis, you become addicted to the world, right? At least before it's terraforming, because spice infuses everything, and almost in every breath, every piece of food, you become sort of infused with this magical mixture of this sort of essence of the cosmos, almost. Do you guys want to say anything about? Yeah. Do you want to say something about that? I guess that's another one of the main components of the whole series is this spice and its accumulation, it's capitalization, it's hoarding, it's scarcity, and I guess the pharmacological effects that are made possible by these different drugs and these different, including like the different poisons, the water of life. There are all these substances that really enhance and make possible so much of the story's narrative.
I think that is kind of a mechanism to help address the lack of, you know what I mean? That's what's interesting about this Butlerian jihad angle is they had to seek out these other organic methodologies for solving these same sort of institutional or machine issue. You know what I mean? They still require these sort of machineries or machinisms.
Gotcha.
They had to have some type of way to access those.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because if you think about both machine technology and then we'll call it mnemonic technology. I mean, you may as well call what the Bene Gesserit do and the Mentats is Foucauldian technologies itself. I think really well. And then this pharmacological stuff. There's two ways you could look at them, and I think you do see people representing these two mindsets in these books. One is that, okay, this is pretty simple. The technology is a technology. I push the buttons and make it go. And, you know, if it's done to me, it makes me do certain things. And that's it's oversimplistic, it's reductionist, but you can get away with it in a lot of ways, right? We do this all the time in our lives. People are like, oh, I need to wake up. Let me take some caffeine in some form, right? We're just sort of like pushing our own buttons. And then there's something is happening to you because of, it could be, you know, training and discipline. It could be the drugs that you're being given. It could be past lives you're experiencing. It could be the technology that you actually have, like that of, you know, the force shield and the knife that you have to learn how to use.
Yep.
And there's the other way is to see it as the human takes these things and doesn't treat them as mere instruments or tools, but they don't dominate the human either. It's still and this is where, like Paul, you know, he takes the spice, and is the spice going to run him, or is he going to run the spice? Is the question, you know? Yeah,
including the risking his life, taking the water of life to finally test whether or not he's the Kwisatz Haderach. I mean, we're told very on in the opening pages about how many men have tried and died doing that. But also, I was also thinking about even with the conflict between Irulan, the sort of princess that he marries in order to ensure becoming emperor, and his Fremen concubine Chani. You know, Irulan is giving Chani these drugs, these contraceptives that eventually end up killing her.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Very fateful there. Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering if part of this was the 60s and the drug craze, but, you know, who knows?
There's also, you know,
sorry, Coop.
Poison used between the houses to try to assassinate, right? Quite often. I forget the name. There's a name for that particular mode of going after your enemies.
Oh, Canley.
That's right. Yeah.
They have very formal rules as it applies to, you can conduct a feud with another house, but there are very specific ways that you can do it.
There's the poison snoopers that are omnipresent in the first book. There's all these machinisms to make sure that your food and your water is not being poisoned. And one of the ways that Harkonnen, who's clever, when he appropriates Thufir Hawat as his sort of assassin and whatever, he gives him the poisons beforehand. And then instead of continuing to give him poison, he just gives him antidotes, which bypasses the snoopers. there's this interesting thread of the substances that are being imbibed, even with the worms. And one of the only ways they can die is through water, which is obviously one of the most essential substances, especially to the Fremen and the people of Dune, and that being the main substance, obviously, is the conservation of water, which gets us back to this ecological bent that Herbert's driving at.
That's a good place to bring in something else. The golden path, right? So it's framed in terms of avoiding catastrophe. I, for the life of me, cannot find in these books a clear formulation of what that catastrophe is supposed to look like, So Leto takes on this burden, whatever we want to call it, of setting humankind on the right path, one that involves a lot of sacrifices, but is going to be less bad than any other course that could be taken, right? And it seems quite interesting for the people who are within the know, but for everybody else in the universe, it kind of sucks, unless you're used to like living in a little village where you never go anywhere and you're never going to go off planet, but it is pretty safe. There's no, great houses feuding with each other or anything like that. But what's this terrible danger, and I think about other sci-fi series where similar problems are being posed. How should mankind or humankind, or even it could be expanded to like humans and other races together, how should we develop and not kill each other and also not degenerate into something inhuman? Dorsey, Gordon Dixon, this is a central problem for those novels.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this arises for a number. Ola Stapleton, who I did a thing on recently with Star Maker, and I forget the other big novel. Similar problem that's being posed. How do you make room for heterogeneity, for people to exercise initiative, to develop their humanity, and very simply put, not to turn into raging assholes who wind up screwing everybody else's lives up, including human nature and the universe.
Coop, you had some notes on this, right? One of the threats, it seemed to be, was this threat of stagnation, and some of that seems to come about in like what the preacher is railing against with the sort of the order of these priests that have come up around around Muad'Dib, and they've become fat on it and they've become stagnant. At least one of the, I don't think it's the only threat, but one of the threats seems to be this almost like Nietzschean theme of decadence and stagnation, whether it be stagnation of progress, like technologically, but also you have to assume it's biological, genetic, that, given how central that is to the vitalistic impulse of the novels. I think that's one of the aspects that's being guarded against, but I'm not sure enough about the whole arc of the series to know what other possible problems are being addressed with the Golden Path. And it seems like the Golden Path also, I'm sure it has Buddhistic implications that I'm aware of, but also seems to be like a golden mean. That maybe on one side there's stagnation, and on the other side is what you were talking about, Greg, with a sort of all-out civil cosmic war.
Which could destroy humanity. I mean, Leto talks in those terms, that it's not just like things are going to get worse for us. This is a non-optimal situation. It's like, if I don't do this, humanity dies. Yeah. I mean, it is a universe in which you can use atomics and destroy planets, but I don't know that all the houses have enough atomics to kill all the planets,
It's true.
I was just going to say, in terms of the novel itself, Children of Dune, he describes the whole impetus for the Golden Path being the typhoon struggle of Krasilek, which I think is probably, just based on the etymology or like the etymological roots, I'm thinking like this is probably a reference to Ragnarok in the sort of Norse mythology.
Yeah.
And the sort of final confrontation, I guess, between humanity and these beings that are like well beyond even Leto himself. And so that's kind of the ultimate goal of the Golden Path, is to repress humanity so intensely that they never want to be this, sort of crystallize themselves in these very stagnant societies where nothing ever really changes. And I guess, that there's no conflict, I guess. There's no dialectic going on, where there's one particular let's see, mode of being to rule them all, perhaps you might say. On the opposite side, though, I do have a certain take that this is, especially within God Emperor, I get the sense that, and maybe here's another point since you brought this up, Taylor's, I think Children of Dune seems a lot more Nietzschean in its approach. But then once you get to God Emperor, I think it takes a more Hegelian approach. And I see the Golden Path as almost this analog for like the Maoist cultural revolution. It's not only just this cultural change, like in Paul's jihad, it's I've got to totally destroy the economy, the breeding, etc., commerce, all of these things have to be repressed in order to achieve the fulfillment of humanity's, to keep this sort of vitalistic thing going in terms of humanity and its proliferation throughout the universe.
I did look through the Dune wiki, and there wasn't really a consensus about, apparently Herbert wasn't exactly clear the form the Golden Path is averting against, the threats.
Danger, yeah.
That's part of the fun, is kind of maybe teasing it out through the hints. Greg, you hit on it, that one of the suggested threats was potentially, whether it be aliens or these sort of higher dimensional beings that could be constructed through sort of other forms of prescient, Kwisatz Haderach, inbreeding, and all of this stuff. That was definitely one of the threats. And I think the other one was what Coop's talking about with this kind of stagnation where humanity, it's almost like the Fremen have this paradise now. And what happens is they kind of they become fat off the land, if you will. And, there's that loss of I don't know what you wanted to say, the vitalistic drive or whatever that supposedly Leto is bringing out through some of the cruelest means, right? Through this repression, through this.
You could call it a loss of genuine identity that required a lot of work to produce and to maintain versus taking on a reduced kind of fake identity. Because there's museum Fremen. And, it's interesting because one of the museum Fremen who's talked about, they characterize him as really wanting to know everything about the real Fremen, on, like experientially what they did. But he's rare. And even in Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, the Fremen they're there, but they're having an identity crisis. They're in decline, right?
Yeah.
So just noting at the end of Chapter House, which is the final book that Frank Herbert himself wrote, there is this reveal of these two characters. It's Marty and I forget the other character. They see Duncan, Idaho. They see Duncan, Idaho within their perceptibility somehow for a moment. But then I think he disappears or something like that. So
he destroys all the data on the ship, right? And goes off into the void, something like that.
So this is where it's getting into what Krozalek actually is, but he never really, he just begins to sort of hint at that and these sort of higher dimensional things, because these sort of new face dancers can absorb memories. So let's say they ran across a Reverend Mother, right? And the Reverend Mother has, all that ancestral memory access. So the face dancers can immediately pick up all of those memories. They can accumulate knowledge at an even more accelerated pace. And so that spools off this positive feedback loop to where I think they eventually become these extremely higher dimensional beings that really threaten humanity as a whole. I think that's the ultimate.
It's interesting, though, because if you think about this, having access to more information, just for us, schlubs here in the 21st century, doesn't necessarily make us any smarter or, better decision makers, because we have the challenge of processing and sifting through and assessing and then integrating this information, right? So, if you think about running across a Bene Gesserit who's got at least female memories going back all these generations, right? I sure as hell couldn't do anything with that. I have a hard enough time just taking these books and, sticking to the narrative in them. So we have to imagine these godlike beings that you almost say to yourself, we can imagine this. We can't really understand how they would possibly do that. You can say, well, they see everything, in one instant, sort of like, when we talked about, in ancient times and medieval times, how can God see all of eternity at once, right?
Right.
Well, he just sees it as a vast present. And then we try to wrap our heads around that and very come up short, right?
Right.
So, having a ton of probably discordant and assertive memory people yammering at you would not be that easy to process.
Yeah.
So
it does seem that one of the aspects that came out was how Paul saw the golden path, but turned away from it because being afraid of losing his humanity, feeling like it would be so lonely and so much of a burden to undertake what Leto II did. And there is this paradox that Herbert tries to bring out where it's like, well, you'd think if you knew all the future and you could kind of plan for it and everything would go smoothly. But in fact, it's almost the banality of evil, as Pascal kind of lays it out, right? Because it's dull, mindless boredom. You know what anything's going to be happening and said, and it becomes its own monstrosity with all of that data arrayed for you.
You would have to be very careful not to be too desirous of novelty and surprises, because that could easily seduce you and lead you off track. And I think this happens to ordinary people in their lives, when they get bored and then they have like a midlife crisis.
I guess this is kind of borne out in the text of the works too, because, we see Paul, he is the Kwisatz Haderach, at least in the first novel, let's say. It's a lot more clear here. So he attains this, but yet we see in Dune Messiah that it's ultimately to his detriment. He's ultimately trapped into nevertheless, prescience itself becomes its own type of trap. And it's perhaps because you're observing this process. And so prescience just throws in another variable, another sort of imminent variable that you have to sort of deal with, that throws off the whole sort of calculation or understanding what paths are available to you to follow, potentially.
His prescience allows him to see many things that could exist but will not exist, because you're seeing all the different possible timelines, subject to certain, restrictions, like the guild navigators can create, apparently, as they reach a certain level. Like, I think if they're like, a master or something, they can create like a bubble where he can't see it. And then later on, the Ixians manage to make a machine that does that in God Emperor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's where they make Hui Nori. Yeah. Good call. Interesting.
But
I forgot about that.
I mean, you're trying to conceptualize all these different paths at once. It's sort of like, back when I was in graduate school in analytic philosophy, possible world semantics became like a really big deal.
Yeah.
And it was fun to play with intellectually, but you couldn't go that far with it. I mean, I understood why they got into it. I think there was like an impulse from, this is cool sci-fi stuff that has been coming up since like A. Van Vogt and, people like that. Let's play around with that. And it might help us to understand what necessity, contingency, possibility are, which I think it was a complete failure with respect to that. I mean, it's the sort of thing that only works if you buy into it. So possible world semantics works really great if you really love possible world semantics and want to ignore every other approach to necessity, possibility, modality, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen it misappropriated and misused for a number of different purposes since. And I never I never went that far into it because I just found it kind of implausible. But it sounds kind of like what poor Paul and Leto go through.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
The sort of redundancy of everything. And which is why I guess Leto II comes to the conclusion that 1,000 years, one heartbeat, it's all the same. This sort of, which is what you kind of mentioned with the medieval theological point about God and eternity and this one expanded present.
Actually, that's a good point. I mean, it makes it difficult to evaluate, right? By that, to properly assign things their value in relation to other things. Mm-hmm. So if you become a god like that, it would be very easy to be like, well, one interesting experience versus the lives of a million people. I'll take the interesting experience, right?
Right.
But Leto doesn't do that.
Yeah, otherwise, I guess it would jeopardize the golden path, which is his ideal, which is his,
his philanthropy, his love for humanity.
Yeah.
It is interesting that I guess Paul is a better exemplar of this, but I think ultimately, at least early on, Herbert is really trying to, I think, critique like a charismatic leaders, like a Hitler, etc.
Yeah.
And so I think part of this too is to show, it's not that there are necessarily these like essences of these leaders that make them fanatics or like lead to murder and like in in Messiah, Paul reflects on Hitler himself and Genghis Khan, and just kind of like their atrocities pale in comparison to mine. And this is all within Paul trying, with his prescience, to take the least harmful path forward, right? There's also a sort of meta critique on even people with the best of intentions are going to be the sort of motor of history is going to direct them a lot more so than how they can necessarily shape history through themselves. Even someone who is this sort of singularity, this like almost, demigod, whether it be Leto or Paul himself. I think Leto seems at least to maybe eliminate some of the trappings of his father. And again, maybe that goes back to his sort of castration or his foregoing of, there's a sort of phallic jouissance that he rejects by not being so invested in reproducing his own lineage, right?
Just to piggyback for a second, this gets back to what the final kind of points about the golden path and the threat of stagnation. It does seem like there are sections, even in your notes, I believe, where Leto II is reflecting on a certain type of chaos, which is not necessarily merely the absence of order, but the possibility for new becomings, if I'm reading Herbert correctly. And it goes against the kind of impossibility of becomings that the paradise regained of terraformed Arrakis has become, leading to as I mentioned, but also with the preacher railing against the new religion and the fanaticism, which is itself its own kind of becoming fat and lazy and tired. It's a truism. Necessity is the invention is
necessity is the mother of invention.
Thank you. I'm totally speaking of chaos. Yes, necessity is the mother of invention. It does seem like part of the stagnation thing is playing that out truly, that if there is no necessity, there is no hardship, there is no, which Leto II imposes in his own way, this new form of hardship.
Yeah. See, this totally gets to that materialist element of, I think it's kind of a crude materialism, right?
Sure.
Of Herbert. It's like that Cultural Revolution thing. You have to till the soil if you want to grow a new body or something like that.
Yeah. So I guess that's part of what this need for a certain type of chaos for new, just for new life to spring forth.
Yeah, because it's like the end of history. It's like the jihad created the end of history. It's almost analogous to like the 90s in the US with like this end of history period. And then comes this moment, then comes this singularity where it's all thrown out the window with 9/11, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did you want to discuss with political theology? Are we getting into this now?
It's definitely a central theme running throughout this with these characters explaining things along the way. There's quite a few info dumps, that Herbert weaves in.
I had this feeling more and more as I was reading Dune, and I don't want to sound self-righteous or performatively woke or something like this, but the Missionera Protectiva, right? This after the Butlerian Jihad and the Bene Gesserit's kind of rise and this whole genetic manipulation stuff that we've talked about. But the seeding of the sort of mythologies throughout the world in order to prepare the way, so to speak, for the shortening of the way for the Kwisatz Haderach. I found it a little problematic insofar as it seemed strange to think that there would be the possibility of, first of all, there not being indigenous mythologies throughout the worlds, but also how the simplicity with which the overcoding of these mythologies and the seeding of them seem to not really present any difficulties. Is it because the Bene Gesserit supposedly have this power of kind of telepathy, mind control? So I mean, is that the simple explanation? Is it just with that sort of mental psychic power that we can explain this? I don't know, not parochialism. Just
I think it's that.
I don't have a word for it.
And I think that it's generation after generation after generation. You can really, when you have a institution that cultivates its members within it and introduces not just a teleology, but a whole set of integrated teleologies. You can really accomplish a lot, in comparison to other people who are more disorganized, right? So
gotcha.
And the Bene Gesserit aren't good guys.
No.
Herbert himself, was pretty clear that they were supposed to be modeled after what the Jesuits used to be like. I mean,
I see.
nowadays, when people are like, oh, the Jesuits and the Freemasons are trying to take over, you're like, yeah, come on, buddy. That might have been true like 200 years ago. But if
Right.
you're taking a look at the order recently, they can't make that sort of thing happen.
Yeah.
But, Herbert was kind of attuned to that. And the Jesuits were, within Catholic orders, there's a whole conversation that could be had here about the massive diversity and formation that goes on and how orders wind up, rising and then having to be reformed and all these
Right.
Think about the Franciscans and the struggle between the spirituals and the regulars and Bonaventure taking over. Well, the Jesuits were an order where they had a dynamic founder, Loyola, right, who had a conversion experience, and then he had 7 buddies, and they start this thing, and then they had like a whole comprehensive education and formation process.
Interesting.
That was superseding that of the previous really, really successful orders, which would include the Benedictines, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and a few others. I mean, the Carmelites, maybe, Anyway, the Bene Gesserits are, kind of a literary far off in space in the future representation of that. And, if you also accept the idea that I think is there very clearly in Herbert and in his characters, that mythologies are important.
Yes.
They run things, in a subterranean way in people's psyches in a way that can't really be controlled by political authorities.
Yeah.
Then I think it makes more sense that they can infiltrate even like Fremen society.
Yeah.
But the Missionaria Protectiva is supposed to like pave the way for the Kwisatz Haderach, but it's also supposed to, in a more mundane way, provide a safe haven for any poor Bene Gesserit who happens to be stranded somewhere. Right?
I see.
There's a longevity component to it as well.
Pointing to the Jesuit origins of the Bene Gesserit kind of brings the point into sharp relief. Although I do see where you're coming from, and I just think it's more so for the like narrative, to be honest. But I think also you could look at it as obviously the Missionaria is extreme. It's colonialism. It's colonialist approach, right? Obviously, that's tremendously problematic on its own right, and I think we could even go to like Oedipal myth there to really kind of link that up. But gosh, I had something else that I was going to say relative to the Missionaria. And I was thinking about looking at our own planet and the impact that, because I think one of the things you brought up was, well, don't these indigenous cultures have their own mythologies? And so I just think that in this colonial world, in this sort of feudalistic approach, those indigenous peoples are repressed just the way, let's say, like the conquistadors, right?
Right.
The indigenous people within South America, for example, obviously had their own mythologies and religions, but then I would assume that the majority of South America would identify as Roman Catholic, largely speaking, at least a significant percentage based on that. So I think there is sort of a real world analogy to be made there.
No, this is good. This put a lot of this in perspective, and I should have even heard the word Jesuit with Gesserit, right? I think that is kind of a nod, right? And so Greg, you put a lot of that in perspective and helped me articulate, I guess, that obviously Herbert is not pro-colonialism, imperialism in the sense, and that the Bene Gesserits are the bad guys. That was helped me bring things back in perspective in terms of this inception of little mythological seeds, and especially your discussion of the sort of interdependence of these teleological aspects that really crystallized it for me. But we can go on from there. What else, Coop, did you want to?
I just want to mention, just to maybe expand a little bit on the Missionaria as like this Oedipal myth, because what it is doing is like, it's this messianism, right? And it's specifically, there is a male figure, a male from the outside that is going to come and lead you to this land of flowing water, etc. Almost like a kind of Moses and monotheism.
It's a Moses myth, yeah.
In a sense, right? Which is kind of neat because they pulled Moses from the water reeds or whatever. But I guess going back to Freud's Moses and monotheism, right? It's Akhenaten, the outsider, that brings monotheism to the Israelites. And so I think maybe that's kind of the analogy in terms of like metaphorically for like a Muad'Dib coming to the Fremen and appropriating, sliding into that, using this Oedipal myth to control, right?
Yeah.
And then incorporate them into the overall state, the despotic state machine, for example. not to mention that, but then we see Paul himself, right? What happens at the end of Messiah? He blinds himself, or he doesn't blind himself, but he is blinded, and then he goes to walk off into the desert very poetically. So I don't know if either of you have a response.
Well, first, just to clarify, because I had two things, but I don't want to sort of hog the conversation. One, I understood that Paul, he gets blinded by some sort of technological explosion, right? That's used against
atomic,
an atomic. So he's literally blinded. But then after the birth of, he has twins, and he only foresaw the birth of the daughter, not the birth of Leto II. And it seems like after this, either he loses faith in his own prescience, or somehow his prescience has left him, because until then, after being physically blinded, his prescience kind of left him able to see in a certain metaphysical way, right?
Well, he could still see. I think that's how he could sort of still walk, and
he could see, but
like even when he was blind.
Due to prescience, though. Due to prescience.
Right. Yes, correct.
But he seems to have lost the prescience after the birth of Leto II, which I guess is that beyond which he could not see, since he had sort of foreclosed the possibility of the golden path. Is that kind of...
it's weird. I don't know how well thought out Herbert really did, because remember, Leto allows him to see through his eyes and to kill the guy that's has them at knife point or whatever. I forget the specifics of it.
The other point I wanted to make before we get off the topic of the Missionara was the fate of the humans that finally got to Arrakis, the Fremen. There is this whole diaspora, the Zen Sunni wandering. Do you want to say a word or two about that you guys would know better than I would? The sort of political pressures that they were under to sort of have to jump from planet to planet before finally settling on this planet?
I mean, I think he's strongly influenced by the Bedouins and Jewish diaspora, but it's weirdly not. I mean, he actually brings up Jews are brought up like specifically in Chapter House or Heretics. I don't recall which, but they do encounter some Jewish people. So I don't know. It's kind of inconsistent, it seems.
Okay.
Towards the end of Dune itself, right, there are those appendices that talk about the religious developments, and some of them are, quite frankly, they make sense at the time that Herbert was writing them, but they're like entirely implausible now.
Right.
So mixing together the popular form of Buddhism that people were encountering at the time is the stand-in for Buddhism, along with does this look anything like Sunni Islam?
No, not really.
Yeah. You could say the Zen Sunnis are much more Zen in that, there's an emphasis on parable and sudden awakening and stuff like that, but it's kind of superficial, right?
Right.
And then the Sunni aspect, I guess, what comes in terms of like the social organization and lots of vocabulary that's taken directly from Islam. But I don't know. I've always found that aspect of no, I can't say I always did. When I was a kid and I was first reading this and I didn't know any better, I'd done any study in comparative religions, I thought this was pretty cool. Now I have to kind of force myself basically just to like put that to the side, the stuff that I know about various religions.
I was more curious, I suppose, because you made a great point, especially with the fact that it does seem just kind of the syncretic aspect. I think is maybe not
put it. Yeah,
it's maybe not as deep, and that's okay. Maybe it's just kind of supposed to be vague and futuristic, and so a lot of its origins are lost. But I was wondering about the political pressures that forced. Was it just that Arrakis became a kind of last refuge for a lot of different humans, and then they eventually coalesced into Fremens? Or was it that Fremens were sort of already an individual social collective and had to be forced from planet to planet, or finally got to Arrakis and then sort of started to change? I wasn't sure about that. I don't think it
was either. I think it was that the Zen Sunnis were forced from
okay.
place.
I see.
And then once they're on Arrakis for a while, they become the Fremen.
Okay, that makes sense. Makes sense. I brought this up because of the political theology. It was a kind of, I suppose it was a kind of political pressure, right? That they were forced out. Is that? I mean,
we don't really know. It could be.
Yeah, I don't think it's
religious freedom. Okay,
it could have been that the worlds that they were on were inhabited by bandits and pirates. Who
Yeah. Okay.
I don't really
So
know.
it's not clear that it was just persecution or something like that.
Right. I don't think it's ever directly addressed that I recall.
Gotcha.
I mean, it could have been that maybe the grass is greener on the other side of the galaxy too, right? Or maybe they were committed to wandering.
That's interesting too. Yeah, that gets back to Coop's point about the Bedouins and this. Maybe that's the superficial sort of Sunni part, right? Is the nomadic aspect.
Yeah, except that most Sunni Muslims historically have not been wandering around anywhere. Again, yeah. You're right. That's a good point, right? I mean, you think about the development of Central Asia before the Mongols came in and messed it all up, and even after that too, right? Most people weren't wandering around all over the place.
Yes.
Maybe we could talk about Herbert engaging in a kind of romanticizing there.
I have a quote from the text that I think would maybe lead us directly into this more directly engaging in the sort of political theology. Because obviously, you can clearly see Paul, Leto are both a type of, they're the sovereign exceptions.
Yeah.
And their status is sort of these demigods. But I'm going to read from the text directly to exemplify this. It was the religion of Muad'Dib which upset Stilgar most. Why did they make a god of Muad'Dib? Why deify a man known to be flesh? Muad'Dib's golden elixir of life had created a bureaucratic monster which satisfied human affairs. Government and religion united, and breaking a law became sin. A smell of blasphemy arose like smoke around any questioning of governmental edicts. The guilt of rebellion invoked hellfire and self-righteous judgments. Yet it is men who created these governmental edicts. So I think the important line here is breaking law becomes a sin. So breaking the law becomes this moral issue, not just violating the secular state, which, you could argue in this sort of political theology is its own sort of, or like humanistic church body, right? But this is really more directly so saying, any transgression against the sovereign is an actual sin, presumably that has the cost of death attached to it. So I don't know if that generates anything.
Well, I had a passage that I bookmarked in Dune Messiah where Jessica says something that is kind of connected with that. She's talking to Alia and she says, this is actually writing. You produce a deadly paradox, Jessica had written. Government cannot be religious and self-assertive at the same time. Religious experience needs a spontaneity which laws inevitably suppress, and you cannot govern without laws. Your laws must eventually replace morality, replace conscience, replace even the religion by which you think to govern. Sacred ritual must spring from praise and holy yearnings which hammer out a significant morality. Government, on the other hand, is a cultural organism, particularly attractive to doubts, questions, and contentions. I see the day coming when ceremony must take the place of faith and symbolism replaces morality. This is while Alia is the regent, governing in place of the twins. And I think there's something to that, right? Anytime that you have too close of a connection between politics and religion, as I think what we're seeing on the right with Christian nationalism here in the United States, it very quickly becomes blasphemous and idolatrous, and the political inevitably takes over the religious, and the religious ceases to be what it originally was, but the religion is still there. You can use it as a means of control and for gaining power and stuff like that. And we see this dynamic over and over again happening,
Yeah, this is the irony of the war machine that Paul assembles, right? Because the war machine, the man of war, is meant to untie bonds, right? Instead of rebind them. But then obviously with Dune Messiah, there is this inversion, the aftermath of it, whereby we see this precisely is what kind of, I think, leads Paul into the desert to find his final transformation as the preacher, to come back and sort of rail against all the things that he either was trying to prevent or not trying to foment with the religious aspect and sort of the parasites of the priesthood that came up in the wake of his martyrdom, his messiahdom. And so much of it, too, is also you can even see the tensions in the first volume, where he's very, even against his mother, he's very kind of sharp and critical and sardonic against all of the missionary, the prophecies that have been laid. He's very wary of them and feels like he's being used as an instrument, right? That he's just a tool in their toolbox. And we see the other side of that aftermath too, right? That around him, even despite him, there are all these other effects that lead to this kind of religious, that lead to even the possibility of questioning the government or the rule being a kind of heresy, and that being so distasteful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost tempted to say, and I don't want this to sound trivializing, there's a bit of coming of age stuff going on. Mother, don't treat me as if I'm just a child.
Yes. Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
That definitely comes out in children as well. One of my favorite parts of the book is just the way the twins just totally walk circles around any adults that they're ever in contact with, just about.
And I think they say, one of them says, like, you adults always underestimate us because you think that we're children. But, I mean, think about it. We're actually containing the memories of people that have been around long before you. Yeah.
Well, it is interesting, too, that in the first Dune, Alia is described as an abomination.
Right.
And that becomes very true in this. I mean, that's literally the name of the possession that is given, right? She undergoes this abomination, which is this kind of, I suppose, this inability to navigate the different ego memories and whatever. And she becomes inhabited, or at least partly controlled by, again, in this Hegelian way, the grandfather figure that she murdered, the Baron.
Ooh, that's a good connection to the Moses and monotheism too there, right? In a sense, yeah. But go ahead, Greg.
Well, I was going to say, I think calling her abomination is something that resonates among the Fremen, but it's essentially a Bene Gesserit designation.
Interesting.
Right? It's a technical term that they use. And it's either Paul or Leto will say, you ladies don't really know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
I'm not denying that Alia's messed up, but you're not quite getting what's going on here. To go back to something, I mean, we brought up Nietzsche a little bit earlier, and I was thinking, we could think about this in terms of like human beings being, as Nietzsche portrays us, kind of a hot mess with a lot of different things that are all little wills to power, and then we have like a hierarchy within ourselves that we sort of participate in and arrange through our own will to power. And you could look at this. You could look at the problem of managing the different, they're not just memories, they're beings within you that consist in these assemblages of memories. They each have, some stronger, some weaker, their own will to power. And so Harkonnen is able to seduce her by saying, hey, I'll help you manage it, granddaughter. I'm really good at this sort of thing. And then she lets him take over, and then she's screwed, right? Now she's lost, and she's a very tragic figure, unfortunately. And, Leto and Paul have to struggle against this as well. I guess, you could say that it's a problem as well for the Bene Gesserit with their limited sets of memories, only the female memories, right? You could think of it as, what do you need to do in order to get the most out of your cacophony of memories? How do you impose your will to power and stay on top without being like eternally vigilant? And Leto says, listen, I've worked out this kind of solution where these different parts are integrated with each other. I'm still on top, but they get quite a bit of not autonomy as such, but they get to participate. It's sort of like, it's not a democracy as such, but it's like a royal council almost, right?
Yeah, almost like a rhizomatic sort of entity. Well, the rhizome can hook up to the arboreal structure too, so maybe it's something like that. So what I was thinking about relative to this, which would be like, maybe to tie it to kind of a Freudian sort of psychical development, would be the reason the abomination applies to Alia, really, and the twins. I guess they technically would be considered abomination as well, because they haven't developed a strong enough ego, whereas the Bene Gesserit, they don't transmute the water of life or imbibe the water of life until later on. They're not born in this state of like inundation by the waters of life, which is, ultimately a poisonous dose of spice. Really, it's like a gargantuan dose of spice that ultimately allows them to access those ancestral memories. So Alia being a child, the twins being children, haven't developed the sense of self. Also Paul, right? He's already sort of reaching maturity in a sense, or like he's at least a teenager, right? So he has a strong enough sense of self to be able to deal with these, like you said, this cacophony of wolves within himself, one or several wolves, to paint a more significant image from Deleuze and Guattari.
I think that the twins do manage it well enough, though, right?
Yeah. Well, how they do that is, I don't think Ghanima ever goes into the spice trance, and whereas Leto is forced to by, I think it's by Gurney Halleck, right? He forces the heavy doses of spice on him, but he negotiates with the past. He sort of develops an agreement with Haroun that allows him to quiet these sort of the rest of the ancestral memories and retain his ego and not fall into the sort of fascistic line of flight that Elia takes, and embracing kind of this phallic element, this masculine jouissance, the phallic jouissance of the Baron, right? Because the Baron is also tied to, like, he's this figure that he eats. He's a completely libidinal figure. He's got these sexual desires. He's a glutton, etc. Like, he's sort of this id personified.
And he's supposedly a homosexual.
That too, right?
And perhaps a pederast. It's hard to tell what age the boys he's being brought in Dune are, but it's outdated now. But that's supposed to be a part of his.
I think that's just to build up a sort of grotesque element, a revolting aspect of the Baron, which obviously doesn't play well in our current.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that, put aside, the same sex issue. What's wrong with him is that he's corrupting and exploitative and cruel and loves dominating and, screwing people up for the sake of that. And sexuality is just one way that he does that. He would be just as bad if he were completely heterosexual and,
exactly.
Behave the same way.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
It's transactional for him. And I assume whatever lovers he takes are probably disposed of in the same way that he disposes of everything else.
You definitely wouldn't want to attract his attention.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an interesting point to bring up, though. The role that you could call it, not just sexual, but romantic desire plays in this. I mean, it's not a radically new theme, right? But should Alia be married to the Gola? Should Duncan breed later on with, I'm forgetting her name, is it Siona?
Siona.
Yeah. Duncan rejects being treated as just a stud in a breeding program.
Yeah.
He'll still end up sleeping with her in the end. He can find something to appreciate in her. And there's the whole thing that, let's go back to the start, as I think Cooper mentioned earlier, the whole shebang gets rolling because Jessica decides to give Leto a son. And why does she do that? Because she loves him. She goes against her own order because of that.
Which is very unlike a Bene Gesserit, because they're extremely pragmatist in their like orientation, which is kind of curious. It's like this strange singularity and then she later comes back to the sisterhood, and like we see that in children.
I mean, there's a sense in which if the Bene Gesserit are really on top of their game, even love itself should be just one more force that they can manipulate whatever way that they want to, but it proves to be not the case.
I mean, they do the sexual imprinting as well. I guess that's talked about with a little bit in Dune with Fade and Lady Fenring.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't tease out so much in the movie, but the book makes it a little bit clearer. But it does seem like part of Jessica's disobedience isn't just love, but partly pride, right? That she thinks,
wanting to be the one who gives.
I can do it. I know that
desire. Right.
It's hard to know if it's whether it's her love for Leto or if it's also partly her narcissism, right? Even like the Freudian sense.
Good call.
Of the mother's narcissism in giving birth to the male child, which is, that's Freud's, like, that's his take.
The best male child.
Yeah, exactly.
Since we just spoke about the Duncan Idaho Gola, I don't know how much you read about this, Taylor. You could probably speak to this a little bit in a couple of facets. So one interesting thing relative to difference and repetition, and I think eternal recurrence, is the character of the Duncan Idaho Gola, because, you know, he first appears in Dune Messiah, but then and obviously dies in Children, but then he comes back in God Emperor, and there are numerous Duncan Idaho Golas, because I think it's been something like 3,500 years since Leto merged with the Sand Trout and became the God Emperor and the, you know, etc. So there's been countless reproductions of Duncan over that time on purpose, because part of what Leto's goal is to also make his own sort of Kwisatz Haderach via Duncan, who really is necessary for Kralazek rather. So whenever the Typhoon struggle of Kralazek actually does come to fruition for Taylor's benefit, the next book is like another time jump of something like 1,500 years or something like that. And so then we still have Duncan Idaho is like the one character that persists throughout all of the published.
I read the wiki on Duncan Idaho, so but keep going.
He keeps coming back, back and back, and they're triggering through like this sort of PTSD, the traumatic kernel is what allows him to retrieve his actual memories of Duncan Idaho and all of the successive Golas, even though they're not really like part of the same series in a sense, because they all resemble one another, but they're not the same series in the way that the Atreides would be, or like the genetic memory that any of the prescient folks can access, right? Because there's a different type of a series there. So I don't know if either of you would want to speak to either of those points relative to Nietzsche, Deleuze, series, difference in repetition, eternal recurrence for that. Because maybe there is like this Overman element to Duncan, and he has a role to play, again, like Kralazek.
My only thing, since I haven't read past book 3, would be I did find it interesting. The main eventuality, obviously not every time, but the main eventuality is his attempt to kill Leto II.
Right.
Because that would be kind of antithetical, not only in the way he rules and the type of domination he exerts, but in other aspects, that would be the antithesis to the love he has for the grandfather, Leto, Paul's father, that Duncan seems to most be loyal to.
Oh, that is interesting.
Well, and to Paul.
That's true.
I mean, I guess you could say it's sort of like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence of the same, which I downplay when I'm interpreting Nietzsche. I think that's less important than a lot of other themes. But, you know, it does capture the one thing where Nietzsche's saying, could you stand it if you actually had, you know, exactly the same thing? Now, this is not exactly the same thing.
Right.
Each incarnation is a different set of circumstances, and they behave differently. You know, there's seem to be like some temperamental differences, or going this way instead of going this way. So it's not really, there is the sense of like, well, could you bear it? Right. And Duncan is the poor bastard, keeps on being reincarnated, right? He doesn't have a choice in it because somebody else is making the decisions. Although, you know, by the end of God Emperor of Dune, the guy who was making the decisions is gone. So, you know, you get the idea that maybe this could be the last Duncan. It's not going to be, but, you know, that he could decide for himself finally, right? And to go back to what Taylor was just saying, the one common thing is sooner or later he's going to try to kill Leto II. But you got to ask, well, why is he trying to kill Leto II? Because there is a evaluation going on that this God Emperor, there's something about him that requires killing. You know, you know how like sometimes we say, that person's face needs punching. You know, that's a trivial way of doing it. And this, it's like a revulsion that develops within him.
Yes.
Or what Leto has become and what he's doing and what he's going to produce. So I think that's an important part of it, the motivational structure, as opposed to he ends up doing this sort of thing. Why does he end up in the same motivational structure every single time? Maybe the golden path is sterile in that respect.
Yeah. But it does seem Leto nevertheless welcomes that. And in fact,
it's something new.
It's something new. He keeps bringing him back. And the eventuality is one of these incarnations is going to help finally fulfill Leto II's own, you know, chosen end with the destruction of the bridge and his death.
right?
But
To all the others. Yeah.
That's the other side of the equation. You were asking obviously what's within Duncan, and I think that it has to be found in his sort of moral fabric or whatever, because he does seem like the character, at least insofar as I've kind of read, who is, I don't want to say the most static. That's not really fair to him, but who is sort of wears his sort of moral code on his sleeve beyond maybe like the Fremen in these other cases. And Paul's more dynamic. Obviously, Leo II goes under enormous transformations. Leah gets, possessed, etc. But Duncan is kind of, you can count on him to be, steadfast in his values.
Right. That is a good point. I think what's interesting too is that, see, this is great too. Like the way that Leto achieves this is not by, there's a type of coercion. But ultimately Leto does what he wants, but of his own free will, which I think is a very interesting thing, given, this kind of, I think, sort of mechanistic materialist approach that Herbert sort of follows, like maybe not always so closely, but I think that is kind of an interesting dialectical materialist approach. Everyone has to sort of desire communism of their own free will for communism to like work, if that makes sense. So the golden path sort of has to follow a similar sort of rubric or pathway, in the way that Leto sets up the chessboard and then the pieces move themselves. He's kind of guiding that process, but in a very sort of removed way. He's controlling by controlling structure rather than by controlling individuals per se.
Although he throws them into situations in which things might happen, right?
Right. But he doesn't ever necessarily, he always leaves a little bit of a space for there to be contingency.
Yeah.
He does know that he's going to die at Duncan or Siona's hands, I think, even, but doesn't know when that's going to happen, when the specifics of that, etc.
I mean, it's not in there, but I wonder if he has a hint, since it's really only water that can catastrophically destroy him. Laser guns will heat him up, and then he farts out some oxygen or something like that.
Yeah. And I guess the only other thing that could kill him would be another sandworm, but they're all gone. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Well, but another sandworm wouldn't.
Wouldn't. Yeah.
Because in Children of Dune, that's one of the things that Leto does to show his new capacity, besides messing everything up, destroying sietches and stuff like that. He walks up to a sandworm, and the sandworm doesn't eat him.
Yeah.
Another sandworm could potentially kill him.
Right.
But if that's also taken away, if the sandworms also kind of worship him, then water would be the one thing. I was just thinking about, in the original Doom, sandworms can only be killed by water and other sandworms, right?
Atomics could kill them. Right?
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Well, they would destroy everything.
Presumably,
area. So I don't think it would be like, boom, it goes off. And then like an action movie, you see Leto slithering out of it behind with a mushroom club. I don't think that would work. But it never comes up, because I think by the time that God Emperor of Dune is taking place, none of the families have their atomics anymore, right? He's taken them all away.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah.
Something interesting too is that, for Taylor, for your edification,
yes,
the bridge collapses and Leto falls into the water, which basically causes all of these new sand trout to disperse.
Mm-hmm.
And each of the new sand trout has a sort of crystal. And I think he even uses, he says pearl. It has a pearl of Leto's consciousness in it. And the new sandworms are supposed to be smarter and more aggressive. And obviously, again, they have this sort of pearl of consciousness, which will ultimately allow, I think this is probably why, I forget, is it Shiana is sort of the young priestess who ends up being able to control the sandworms later on in Chapter House.
It's a bad time to be on Arrakis after that happens, right?
Yeah.
He predicts that not just thousands, but millions are going to die, and they're going to have to readapt themselves. But now they've got to deal with sandworms that are a lot smarter than what they had in the past. So
can't just ride them like a bus stop, like a big bus. Yeah, you gotta. But I suppose that's the dialectic, is forcing humans to have to adapt.
Exactly.
Also become more ingenious and creative. I think that's the dialectic of creativity and the in this politics and this horrible golden path that Herbert's trying to paint.
He directly says as much in Children of Dune. I mean, I feel like that's a good place to stop, actually, unless either of you had any more final thoughts that you wanted to wrap up on. And if you don't have any final thoughts, Greg, if you want to plug anything, rather.
Eventually, I do want to start shooting some speculative fiction studies things on Dune, but I'd probably begin with the first book because it's so rich and there's so much going on in it. But people can, find that in my video channel. I just recently did a whole series, which I haven't completely released, on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And I'm going to be following that up with some stuff on Dix, the android and the human talk that he gave. That's, I think, quite good, I do have a speculative fiction series called Worlds of Speculative Fiction that it's a monthly thing. It was originally face-to-face, but now it's online and people can easily find the videos for that. I'm doing Rogers Lasney this month. So
we'll have links to your YouTube.
I'll link your channel and probably because you did one of those on Dune specifically, the first book already. So I'll definitely throw in a link there too.
Yeah. And down the line, I actually do want to revisit these. And I don't know if I would do like a session on each of them the way I did with R. Scott Bakker and The Second Apocalypse, because they're so long,
Yeah,
but definitely on the other 5 books in some sort of configuration.
I definitely would love to, if you're looking for anybody to dialogue with, this is one of my favorite things. I bring Dune, bless Taylor's heart for like me asking like every guest. I bring up Dune all the time. So
Dune and Sterner, those are Coop's
my hobby horses.
And
there's 2 poles.
It
oscillates between.
It took a year or so, but Coop has pilled me on both of them now. So I can officially, it's brought us closer together.
I cornered him into it where he basically had no other choice but to do it. So
yeah, Dune and Sterner, that's probably a unique combination, but I enjoy both of them very much. I knew I would enjoy Dune. There was no doubt. The Sterner, I very quickly found out that I vibed with him too. So no complaints. Yeah. And now I get to Deleuze pill him, as you've seen some of the fruits of that today. So that's my give and take.
Okay.
We can also link your Twitter page if you'd like, because that way people can follow and keep up with all the great content you put out. I really appreciated your stuff on the Stoics recently, the Stoics and the Epicureans, and going back to ancient philosophy. That was good I'm always down to learn about ancient philosophy that's not just Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, although, once you get away from sort of like the standard fair Plato and Aristotle, there's a lot of cool stuff going on in both.
That's true
as well. Yeah,
that's true. I just feel like they get a lot of love, right? It's kind of like hearing a great song on the radio 100 times, and you're like, okay, I just need a break. Yep.
Well, and the problem is the people who want to do ancient and all they really do is focus on Plato and Aristotle.
Yes.
I've actually got a piece that I'm reworking where I argue that Plato is not the best Platonist and Aristotle is not the best Aristotelian.
I love it.
In part because the later commentators could take their ideas and then bring them into contact with the Epicureans or the Stoics or the Skeptics. Yeah. And took certain things further than their originals did. So like I say, Plutarch is a better Platonist than Plato is.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's great.
Alexander of Aphrodisias than Aristotle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's almost a kind of buggering in the Deleuzian sense. It's a buggering that's more faithful than the original.
Yeah.
It's a Plato Gola, right?
That sounds like that could be maybe a fun future episode for us to look at maybe Epicurus or
ancient philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We did read Marx's dissertation about Epicurus and Democritus. So and I have an interest in Epicurus
I haven't read that
specifically.
Sometime.
It's a pretty quick read. It's not like
something like 45 pages.
Yeah, it's a quick read, and we really enjoyed Thomas Nail's Marx in Motion. He makes a good argument for why it helps to make sense of just the fundamental aspect of movement in Marx in all of his analyses. And I think that helped me become a better reader of Marx rather than necessarily the ancients. So it was kind of a 2 birds, 1 stone,
Once again, thanks to Greg Sadler for joining us on this week's edition of the Machinicon Conscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
Thanks for having me.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity. ultimate form of singularity, which is recurrence. The whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.